Hello, today I'm here with Frederick Kaufman, author of The Money Plot, A History of Currencies, Power to Enchant, Control, and Manipulate. Frederick, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Alan. Thank you so much.
So I am always a fool for a good plot, and money have been manipulating our life, but we also have been manipulating money throughout our existence. So I don't know who is controlling who is got the course, like the marionette, who is got the course of controlling the other person. And also, I am enchanted by money being a creation of our imagination. It's not real. All those paper money is have no more value than this piece of paper, but yet we are willing to even die for it. So I'm happy you're gonna tell us more about the history of money. But before that, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Let's say when you were going to high school and decide what to do as a career, what was going on in your mind at that time?
Oh my Lord, what a question. So my father was a writer. I'm from Los Angeles, and my father was a Hollywood screenwriter, which maybe gives you an introduction into why I am so interested in the world as a fiction. I grew up in La La Land. And so I knew I was going to be a writer, and I became a magazine writer after college. And then I wrote a novel, decided I would be a professor, got my PhD, and then started writing. None of this makes much sense, Alan. I started writing about food at that point.
Okay.
And in my third book,
Why food?
I was very interested in terms of things that we use by consuming. In other words, we use food by consuming food the same way, oddly enough, we use money by consuming money. So I was always fascinated by these ideas of commodities. I couldn't exactly tell you why. There's a technical name for it. They're called fungibles. And I always loved the idea of fungibility, that thing which you consume in order to use. Okay. And my third book, I was writing about kind of an investigative piece about the relationship of Wall Street and global hunger, and how the price of food had been driven up to incredible heights during the financial crises earlier in this century, the crises of 2008 and 2011. And in order to understand how food got its price, I had to understand the great commodity markets of the world. And so the great grain exchanges, and these are all traded with grain futures and livestock futures, these strange financial items called derivatives. And I had to understand what that meant. And I studied the futures market, and I could not understand it. Here I have a PhD in English. I know all these poetics, and it took me a year. And then all of a sudden it occurred to me, money is a fiction. It's pretend. And that's how you can sell 10 times as much grain as exists on Earth when you don't own any of it, and then buy it back, and it's just a fiction. And so, of course, I live in New York, and I started talking to my economist friends. I got friends who are bankers. I live in downtown Wall Street. I'm like, guess what I found out? And they're like, what? And I said, money is a fiction. And they were like, yeah, I know. like they're the masters of it. These guys, they get it. The bankers, the Wall Street guys, they know it's a fiction. And in fact, you're talking about the paper. It's not even paper. I mean, around 5% of the world's money has any material form whatsoever. The rest is just like flickering numbers on a screen that then disappear. So it's all what we English professors would call an imaginary. And that was how I came to write this book.
Wow. Yeah. Yesterday was the IPO of Airbnb, which is a fiction stock. I borrow fictional money from a bank. I bought some fictional stocks that now sits in my bank account. And if one day I sell it, I will make fictional money that I will be able to use to buy groceries. Okay, so it is fictional, but it has like a loose string attached to reality. For in the example of commodities, yes, there is millions and trillions of dollars being exchanged digitally, But at the end of the day, there is a real piece of bread that people eat and buy. And so although the relationship is very loose, there has to be somehow this relationship. Okay, so how did you start doing the research for this book, the money plot? I see that you divided it into two segments, small money and big money. So can you tell us what is small money and big money?
I will. First, let me just make a comment about yesterday's initial public offering. Of course, one of the great fictions, of course, is this idea of shareholding, right? That somehow this company can be cut up into all these little shares, purely imaginary, and that then I can somehow own them. And then somehow on another level, on another poetic level, there's a money value priced to these shares. And one of the things that I found most fascinating in my research for this book in terms of small money and big money was right at the fulcrum of when small money becomes big money. And that is in the medieval period. That is in the medieval times. And the entire idea of corporate shareholding, as we understand it today, comes quite specifically from what's called the commercial revolution of the Middle Ages. And usually there's this general sense in history, not usually, but for a long time, that the church and the bankers were opposed to each other. In fact, modern history has shown that's not at all the case. In fact, the medieval church, the medieval Catholic Church, was the largest corporation in all of Europe. And it was a great multinational corporation. And the branches of the Medici Bank that were closest to the Vatican were, of course, the most profitable. And in fact, we can pinpoint the exact date of the growth of the idea of corporate personhood, which is kind of what lies behind all of these IPOs. And that is the Lateran Council of Pope Innocent IV in 1250. I mean, this is where my research for the book led me to all sorts of nooks and crannies of history. And in this Lateran Council, the church decided, A, that all cardinals should wear red hats, very important, and B, that the church body itself was a corporation, what he called a persona ficta, a fictional body. And so we can see this has played out in history in terms of, let's say, freedom of speech for corporations, in terms of political advertising, right? But the whole notion that the Pope had back then was the church was deeply involved in, let's say, mortgaging its properties, in lines of credit. And what he said is that if you default, if any monk or any abbey defaults their property, that actually is going to harm the body of Christ, that the body of the church is actually the corporation of Christ. And this idea of an actual body and the corporation being that, and of course, what is a share in the body of Christ? Well, anybody who's taken communion knows exactly what we're talking about. Getting back to food. And this is an archaic, of course, this also goes back to archaic notions of sacrifice of animals and sharing in the burnt offerings. And this also is very closely related, again, to primitive money, where that first money comes from. And we see that kind of metal money happens in archaic Greece, when in fact, for the first time, you have these animals sacrificed to all these various gods and deities, that they are then skewered and they're put on these metal skewers and cooked. And then the acolytes eat them and share in the corporate body. And eventually the metal skewers themselves start substituting for the shares in the corporate body. And this leads to the first precious metal coinage, which occurs in the Peloponnese right around the birth of tragedy, around 500 BC. Now, of course, I haven't answered your question, which is, what is the difference between big money and small money? And if I can just elaborate for a moment on that, what was shocking to me in this book, and I think what's shocking to most people, is the idea of money before markets. And that's one of the big differences between small money and big money. This idea of primitive money, of shells, of teeth, of bones, of gongs, of woodpecker feathers, all sorts of these things can be used as money before markets. We have this idea that Adam Smith gave us in The Wealth of Nations in 1776, that money came from barter, that before there was money. The anthropologists and the ethnographers have flatly disproven the theory, that there are no barter economies that predate exchange money. In fact, we only see barter economies in post-market economies, such as wartime economies, right, of scarcity, or let's say prison economies, candy, drugs, weapons. So that's kind of the demarcation between small money and big money has to do right in that medieval fulcrum and the explosion of markets and commercial culture in Europe.
Okay. How about the money and gold, the creation of money through all these IOUs that gold, that they go. Okay, I'm getting my thought. So the people who had gold were giving IOUs that represent that money, and people started trading those IOU, creating, expanding the velocity of money. But also it came from well, it was the real gold out there, but all these notes, it started trading as a currency itself. And I guess that's in a way in which we got hooked to have a currency pinned to gold, no?
Well, I spend a lot of time in the book talking about gold, absolutely, yeah. Because of all the metaphors for money, gold has been one of the most persistent, right? And of course, one of the things we have to realize off the bat is gold, there's no reason why gold should be money. It could just as easily be silver or oil or grain or livestock, all of which have served as the quote unquote underlying value, right, of money. But what's so interesting about gold is the modern history of money. And when I say the modern history of money, I mean like the last 200 or 300 years, has really been a narrative of money trying to escape gold. Mm. That money in its essence is something metaphorical, something spiritual, something that like a form of a power that can inhabit material objects, such as a tooth, such as a bone. So you have the ancient soothsayer casting the magic spell on, let's say, the bead money. And then that bead money serves as a safety net, much like Medicare or Medicaid or Social Security serves as a safety net. Except in bead money, right, the ancient soothsayer casts a spell and you wear it on your body, and then you walk through life protected, much like the ancient epic heroes would walk through life protected. Now, gold, of course, and all the metals also were at their own different moments in history, gods. There are gold gods and silver gods, the moon is a silver goddess, all of these things. And the history of them, of these metal gods, is always sad and tragic, in the sense that there's the golden age and gold rules for a while, and then he gets destroyed by silver, and then she reigns for a while. And of course, they don't just get destroyed, they get utterly obliterated and thrown all across the planet. And of course, this explains to the early mind why we have to mine for gold, that it's been scattered, and that we have to, once again, repair it, redeem it, bring it back together, make it whole again. These are spiritual ideas, right? And so money, since the first coinage, the first precious metal coinage I was saying before, comes from a part of the Turkish coast today in an ancient kingdom called Lydia. And it was King Alyattes, whose son was the great Croesus, as in like riches Croesus. And he came up with the first precious metal coinage. It was a silver gold mixture called electrum. Again, about 500 BC, right around the birth of tragedy. And of course, there's nothing more tragic than a precious metal coin, right? You mint it with the great ruler's face on it, the great man. And then of course, 20, 30 years later, he's over, he gets killed, he gets dismembered. They melt it all down, they put another person's face on it, right? It's the most tragic of all things. But what we're seeing in the past 200 years is this increasing sense that money does not have to be attached to anything material. And that final step came in America, and really for global currency in 1971. And I spent a lot of time on Friday, the 13th of August, 1971, when President Richard Nixon and his cabinet retreated to Camp David because they did not have enough gold in the Federal Reserve to satisfy you and all your Canadians' demands to change sovereign currency. And so, like I say, the original idea for the book was to just be about that weekend when Nixon floated the dollar. And he made the dollar, he unmoored it from anything material and said, okay, from now on, the dollar is just a story. And that story is called Full Faith and Credit of the United States.
Right. What can you tell us about the creation of money now in amidst the pandemic, the coronavirus? How the government, just out of a click of a button in their computer, were able to create, I don't know, billions of dollars?
Yes, this really has been a question that a lot of people are interested in right now. Like for instance, I'm sitting here in New York City in the United States, and for the past several years during the last administration, the Trump administration, people are arguing we cannot give $20 million to food stamps. We cannot afford to do this. And then all of a sudden, there's COVID. It's like $1 trillion appears. Okay, so a lot of people are a little concerned about what is that $1 trillion anyway? I have a little suspicion here. And so, of course, what's interesting here is the global suspicion of money in general has been growing. Really since the internet, and we have a global scam economy, a global phishing economy, and there's a very, and of course, with the advent in 2009 of the quote unquote Genesis block of Bitcoin, and now we have more than 2,000 cryptocurrencies. And really, after that first kind of financial crisis in 2008, 2011, we have the growth of artisanal currencies. I mean, look, people believe in airline miles, for crying out loud, right? So money itself is under a very interesting pressure right now, and particularly the dollar is under pressure right now. And so a lot of people are saying, well, if we emit $1 trillion, and if we're about to emit another $1 trillion, are we going to see hyperinflation? Is the dollar going to lose value? Are we going to see an economic meltdown? Now, I'm not an economist. I am an English professor, but it appears clear from my understanding of the history of money, which is that money has gone through many apocalypses. And in fact, the greatest period of apocalypse in not modern history, but in European history, once again, the medieval period with the bubonic plague and the very strong sense of Rome falling and all the barbarians. That was a period of tremendous growth of commercial culture and money. So I'm not afraid that this what appears to be an apocalyptic moment is going to necessarily end in tragedy for money and for the dollar. It could actually be a tremendous growth period of understanding for the dollar. Let me just add one other thing to this in terms of showing our new perceptions. So I don't know how closely you were following the election, the Democratic primaries in this country.
There's no way to ignore it.
Yeah, no way to ignore it. So we had one of the candidates was Andrew Yang.
Yes.
And Andrew Yang, of course, was advocating a universal basic income, right? And 20, 30, 40 years ago, Alan, this idea would have been completely dismissed immediately as completely crackpot, if not dangerous and communistic, right? Because that was the go-go 80s when there's Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and the Berlin Wall falls, and we think global capitalism is going to take over. And yet, about 40 years later, a lot of people are scratching their heads thinking, well, maybe there is something to a universal basic income, right? And that shows this incredible elasticity of money and our changing understanding of what it's for. And getting back to an original notion, what it's for is insurance, it's for security, it's for the ability for us to define our trajectory going from the past into the future. And my book follows this true trajectory of money all the way through prehistoric money to cryptocurrency, which has so much in common with primitive money.
How about when people stop believing the story, like when we had hyperinflation inflation in Germany, that people just didn't believe the value of the money anymore, and then people went back to trading, I don't know, cattle versus grain or something?
Yeah, well, credit, of course, comes from the Latin word credo, I believe. So money must it necessarily depends on what people as a group believe in. Money then, if we just keep on following the logic, is a social construction. It's a social concept. I can't just say, here's my Fred Kaufman dollar, right? Nobody would believe me. So, but that's also a positive thing. It's a positive thing, which is that, once again, if the Federal Reserve emits $1 trillion, and we all believe that they're good dollars, and we exchange them, we go back and forth, there is no problem with it. By the same token, we can see what happens when we necessarily don't believe in money. So one of the examples I like to use is the gender of money. The idea that at different points in history, money has been female and money has been male. So for instance, for the ancient Romans, Juno Moneta was a female goddess of money. And also in like 17th century and 18th century England and Europe, it was lady credit or Regina Pecunia, right? The queen of money, the queen of credit. But of course, money lately has been a lot more male. Like ever since we have Gordon Gekko and Wall Street and greed is good and the man with the most toys wins and the man with the most toys, one of those toys is a trophy wife, right? We have male money. And so if you look at US money, for instance, and the sexism is particularly rampant in the United States, right? So in other parts of the world, you might see female figures and personifications on money. United States, no. Like we do not want Harriet Tubman on our $20 bill. And in fact, when we had Susan B. Anthony dollars and we had Sacagawea dollars, both of which featured females, right, on the dollar, right, we emitted millions of them, but nobody wanted to circulate them. They immediately just became collectibles, which is very different than money in currency exchange, right? So we have to believe it. We have to believe in the gender of money. Typical example was in the 19th century when Queen Victoria died. When Queen Victoria died, many English merchants refused coins with her face on them. It was dead.
Wow, amazing, amazing.
It's mind-blowing, right? It's mind-blowing.
Well, you have so many amazing stories in this book. You have the shell game, the trophy wife, the art of violence. I mean, it's just an endless piece of joy. Fred, thank you so much for, can you tell us one more time where people can find the book and where can they follow you? I found you in Twitter, but yeah, tell us where we can follow you and buy the book.
Alan, you're so kind. Thank you for having me. I'm fairly active on Facebook. I have an author's site, Frederick Kaufman, and then my own personal site. I'm happy to be your friend. And the book is available at your local independent bookstore. And of course, if you buy it on Amazon, my Amazon ratings will go up. That doesn't, whatever. But it's out there. I was just at Barnes & Noble yesterday, and there it was on the shelf. Yeah, I hope you will enjoy it. And thanks again for inviting me on your show.
Fred, thank you so much for joining us.